want to have a child with you.
Lady, you've been hanging upside down too long. Blood's gone to your head.
She said, I want your child. But first the Apache woman had to know if he was worthy Silver Creek Valley, Colorado territory. November 1882. The smoke was wrong. Josiah Mercer had lived alone in these hills for 6 winters, and he knew every curl of mist that rose from the valley floor, every wisp that twisted from a dying campfire. This smoke was deliberate, thin and steady like a signal rather than warmth. He set down his splitting axe and wiped the sweat from his weathered hands. The late afternoon sun painted the canyon walls the color of dried blood. His cabin sat tucked against the eastern ridge, a day's ride from the nearest town, 2 days from anything resembling civilization. That's how he preferred it. The war had taught him that men were capable of cruelties that made wolves seem gentle by comparison. If you're enjoying this story about courage and unexpected love in the Old West, please comment the number 1 below to let me know you're listening. Your support helps me create more of these tales. The smoke rose from Widow's Canyon, a narrow gash in the earth where the old stage road used to run before the Apache Wars made it too dangerous. Josiah grabbed his rifle and a coil of rope, then started down the deer trail. His left knee protested an old injury from Chickamauga that acted up when the weather turned. He ignored it, as he ignored most reminders of his past. The canyon walls pressed close, blocking out all but a ribbon of gray sky. The smoke grew thicker, carrying the sharp scent of green wood, someone who didn't know how to build a proper fire or didn't care about being seen. Josiah moved carefully, rifle loose in his hands, remembering how to walk without sound from his scouting days. Then he saw her. An Apache woman hung upside down from a broken fence, post her ankles bound with rope, her arms tied behind her back. Her long black hair swept the ground like a dark waterfall. She wasn't moving, but he could see the slight rise and fall of her chest. The position was grotesque, designed to humiliate as much as harm. Blood had pooled in her face, giving her skin a dusky purple tinge. Josiah scanned the canyon walls, looking for movement, for the glint of metal or the shadow of a waiting ambush. Nothing, just the woman and the pathetic fire smoking nearby, built from wet pine that would announce its presence for miles. He approached slowly, rifle at the ready. The woman's eyes snapped open when he was 10 feet away. They were dark as winter water, and they studied him with an intensity that made him pause. She didn't cry out, didn't plead, just watched. Easy now, he said, though he wasn't sure if she spoke English. I'm going to cut you down. He pulled his knife and sawed through the rope at her ankles. She fell heavily, unable to catch herself with her arms still bound. Josiah caught her before she hit the ground, feeling the fevered heat of her skin through her deerskin dress. She weighed less than a yearling calf, all sharp bones and lean muscle. He cut her arms free and helped her sit up against a boulder. She rubbed her wrists, working feeling back into her hands, never taking her eyes off him. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25 winters. A small scar ran through her left eyebrow, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who knew hard work. Who did this to you? He asked. She tilted her head, studying him like a hawk might study a rabbit. Then, in clear English, tinged with only a slight accent, she said, "You live in the cabin on the eastern ridge. Alone." It wasn't a question. Josiah's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but she made no threatening move. "I've watched you," she continued. 6 moons now. You split wood every afternoon. You talk to your horses like they're people. You drink coffee at dawn and whiskey at dusk, but never enough to lose yourself. She paused, then added the words that would haunt him, "I want to have a child with you." The canyon seemed to tilt. Josiah had been prepared for many things: an ambush, a plea for help, even death, but not this. "Lady, you've been hanging upside down too long. Blood's gone to your head." She stood slowly, swaying slightly but refusing his offered hand. "My name is Aiyana. It means eternal blossom. My grandmother gave it to me because I survived when my twin brother did not." She brushed the dirt from her dress with careful dignity. "And my mind is clear, clearer than it has ever been. Look, Miss Aiyana, you've been through something terrible. Let me take you to town, Find you help. No town. Her voice turned sharp as flint. Towns mean questions. Questions mean trouble for Apache women found tied up by white men's fences. She looked at the marks on her wrists. Even when the tying was their own choice, Josiah felt the world shift again like ice creaking under his feet. What do you mean your own choice? Aiyana walked to the pitiful fire and kicked dirt over it, killing the smoke. Have you ever been desperate enough to test whether the spirits are listening, Josiah Mercer? The sound of his name on her lips made him step back. How do you? I told you. I've been watching. She turned to face him fully, and he saw something in her eyes that wasn't fear or trauma but calculation. My people want me to marry Black Crow. He has 3 wives, already beats them when the mood takes him, and believes a woman's only purpose is to bear sons and tend fires. The council supports him because he's a strong warrior. Strong warriors make strong sons. So, you ran. No. She picked up a handful of earth and let it sift through her fingers. Running would mean leaving my grandmother, my sisters, my people's bones. I cannot run from who I am, but I can choose who fathers my children. She looked at him directly. If I'm to bear a child, it will be with a man who speaks gently to horses and sits alone rather than hurt others. Josiah's mind was reeling. And hanging yourself upside down from a fence post A test, she had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. My grandmother says the spirits show a man's true nature and how he responds to suffering. A cruel man would have taken advantage. A coward would have run. A good man, she gestured at him, a good man cuts the rope and asks questions. This is insane. Is it? Aiyana challenged. More insane than you hiding in these hills, because the war showed you too much of men's darkness. More insane than drinking just enough whiskey to dull the dreams, but not enough to forget. She stepped closer, and he caught the scent of sage and wood smoke in her hair. We're both hiding from different wars, Josiah Mercer. Perhaps it's time we stopped hiding alone. Before he could respond, the sound of horses echoed through the canyon, multiple riders moving fast. Aiyana's composure cracked for the first time, real fear flashing across her face. They weren't supposed to come this soon, she whispered. Who? Black Crow and his brothers. They've been tracking me. She grabbed his arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. If they find you with me, they'll kill you. Let them try. Josiah checked his rifle, counting cartridges by touch. You don't understand. There are 5 of them, and they... She stopped, cocking her head. No. They're splitting up. 3 continuing down the canyon, 2 circling back toward... Her eyes widened. Toward your cabin. Josiah cursed. He had ammunition there, supplies, defensive positions. Out here in the open canyon, they were exposed. Can you ride? He asked. Better than you probably. Despite everything, he almost smiled. My horse is picketed about a 1/4 mile up the trail. Think you can make it? She was already moving. Try to keep up, white man. They ran through the gathering dusk, Josiah's bad knee screaming with every step. Behind them, the sound of horses grew closer. Aiyana moved like smoke through the rocks, barely disturbing a pebble, while Josiah crashed through like a wounded bear. When they reached his horse, a steady bay gelding named Moses, she was already untying the picket line. Get on, Josiah said. Both of us Moses can handle it. Moo. She swung up easily, settling behind the saddle. Josiah mounted in front of her, feeling her arms wrap around his waist. Her body pressed against his back, warm and alive. Your heart is racing, she observed, her breath tickling his ear. We're being chased by 5 Apache warriors. Seems appropriate. No. Her arms tightened slightly. It started racing when I touched you. Before he could deny it, Moses lurched forward. They rode hard through the darkening canyon, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the stones. Behind them, shouts echoed off the walls. An arrow whistled past close enough that Josiah felt the wind of its passage. They're warning shots, Aiyana said. If Black Crow wanted you dead, you would be. Comforting. They burst from the canyon onto the upper trail. Josiah's cabin sat a half-mile ahead, a dark square against the purple sky. No smoke from the chimney. He'd banked the fire that morning, not expecting to need warmth until evening. Now he wished he'd left it burning. A cold cabin was harder to defend. As they approached, Josiah saw 2 riders already there, circling the building. One carried a torch. "They'll burn it," he said. "Only if you're inside." Aiyana slid from the horse before he'd fully stopped. "Black Crow wants to frighten you, not start a war with the whites. An empty cabin burned is an Apache warning. A cabin burned with a white man inside is a massacre that brings soldiers. And if you're inside," she looked at him steadily, "then I'm a woman who chose her own fate." The two warriors had dismounted and were examining the cabin. One was tall and broad-shouldered with 3 eagle feathers in his hair, Black Crow Josiah guessed. The other was younger, leaner moving, with the nervous energy of someone eager to prove himself. "Stay here," Josiah said, but Aiyana was already walking toward them. She called out in Apache, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. Both warriors spun hands, moving to weapons. Black Crow's response was sharp, angry. The younger warrior added something that made Aiyana's shoulders tense. Josiah didn't understand the words, but he understood tone. These men were furious, humiliated, dangerous. He moved Moses' closer rifle across his saddle, trying to look non-threatening while being ready for violence. The argument continued, voices rising. Black Crow gestured at Josiah with obvious contempt. Aiyana stood her ground, giving as good as she got, her voice never wavering. Then Black Crow said something that made her go silent. He smiled ugly and triumphant and repeated it. Aiyana turned to Josiah. "He says you're weak. A coward hiding from his own people. He says you wouldn't last a day living as Apache, that you'd run at the first hardship." She paused. "He offers a challenge." "What kind of challenge?" "Single combat. If you win, he leaves and never troubles us again. If he wins, she didn't need to finish. And if I refuse, then he's proven right. You're a coward, and no Apache woman would lower herself to bear a coward's children. I would have to go with him to preserve my family's honor." Josiah studied Black Crow. The man was younger than him by maybe 10 years, obviously stronger, trained as a warrior since childhood. Josiah had been a soldier, yes, but that was different. Soldiers fought in lines with rifles and cannons. Warriors fought with skill and cunning. "Tell him I accept." Aiyana's eyes widened slightly. "Josiah, tell him." She spoke to Black Crow, who laughed, and began removing his weapons, setting aside his rifle, his knife, his tomahawk. He spoke to the younger warrior, who began drawing a circle in the dirt about 15 feet across. "The rules are simple," Aiyana explained. "No weapons. You fight until one yields or cannot continue. Try not to die." Helpful advice. Josiah dismounted and removed his gun belt, his knife, his coat. The evening air was cold against his skin. He rolled up his sleeves, noting how Black Crow watched him with the attention of a predator studying prey. They entered the circle from opposite sides. Black Crow was built like a mountain cat, all lean muscle and coiled power. His skin bore numerous scars, testament to a lifetime of violence survived. Josiah felt every one of his 38 years, every old wound, every night spent sleeping on cold ground. Black Crow struck first, impossibly fast, a fist that caught Josiah in the ribs and drove the air from his lungs. He staggered back, barely avoiding the follow-up knee that would have ended the fight immediately. Black Crow pressed his advantage, raining blows that Josiah could barely block, driving him toward the edge of the circle. Then Josiah's heel caught a stone and he fell backward. Black Crow pounced, and for a moment they grappled on the ground. The Apache was stronger, but Josiah had learned to fight dirty in a dozen battlefield brawls. He got a thumb in Black Crow's eye, making him rear back, then drove a knee into his stomach. They separated, circling again, both breathing hard. Blood ran from Josiah's nose, and his left eye was already swelling shut. Black Crow spat blood and smiled. "You fight like a white man," Aiyana translated his words. All desperate anger, no grace. "Tell him he fights like a man who's never lost anything that mattered," Josiah replied. When Aiyana translated, Black Crow's smile vanished. He came in again, but this time Josiah was ready. He took the first blow on his shoulder, letting Black Crow's momentum carry him forward, then brought his elbow down on the back of the warrior's neck. Black Crow stumbled, and Josiah kicked his knee from the side, sending him down. For a moment, Josiah had the advantage. He could have pressed it, could have tried to end the fight. Instead, he stepped back, letting Black Crow rise. The Apache warrior stood slowly reassessing. They circled again, and this time when they clashed, it was with mutual respect. They traded blows more evenly, each giving and taking damage. Josiah's ribs screamed, his knee buckled, but he stayed upright, stayed in the circle fueled by something that wasn't rage or fear, but simple determination not to fail, not in front of her. Finally, both men stood swaying, barely able to raise their fists. Black Crow said something in Apache, then dropped his hands and stepped out of the circle. "What did he say?" Josiah asked through swollen lips. "He said you fight like a man who has lost everything and chosen to live anyway," Aiyana translated. "He respects that. The challenge is over." Black Crow spoke to Aiyana at length, his tone different now, still disapproving but no longer contemptuous. Then he and the younger warrior mounted their horses. Before leaving, Black Crow looked back at Josiah and spoke once more. "He says you're still weak," Aiyana translated, "but perhaps weak men who stand their ground are more dangerous than strong men who have never been tested." She paused. "It's as close to a blessing as you'll get from him." The two Apache rode off into the darkness. Josiah stood there until the sound of hoofbeats faded, then his knee gave out entirely, and he sat down hard in the dirt. Aiyana knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she examined his injuries. "You're a fool. Probably. You could have been killed. But I wasn't." She tore a strip from the bottom of her dress and used it to dab blood from his face. "Why did you fight him? You don't know me. You owe me nothing." Josiah caught her hand, stilling its movement. "Maybe I'm tired of owing nothing to nobody." They stayed like that for a moment, her hand in his, the stars beginning to emerge overhead. Then she helped him to his feet and into the cabin. The inside was sparse, a single room, with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace. Josiah had built it for function, not comfort. But Aiyana moved through it like she belonged there, lighting the oil lamp, starting a fire, heating water for his wounds. "How long were you really watching me?" he asked, as she cleaned a cut on his cheekbone. 2 months. She didn't look embarrassed about it. "I needed to know what kind of man lived here, whether you were dangerous. And what did you decide? That you were the saddest man I'd ever seen." She moved to the cut on his lip. "You do everything with such care, such precision, but without joy. Like you're performing a punishment instead of living a life." "Maybe I am." Why, Josiah was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. "I was at Chickamauga, second day of the battle. My unit was supposed to take a ridge held by Confederate artillery. We charged 13 times. 13. By the end, we were stepping on bodies so thick you couldn't see the ground." He stared into the fire. "I killed boys who hadn't started shaving yet. I killed men who cried for their mothers. And when it was over, when we finally took that worthless piece of high ground, I stood there covered in blood and realized I felt nothing. Nothing at all." Aiyana's hand stilled. "So you came here to feel something again?" "I came here to make sure I never had to feel that nothing again." He looked at her. "Turns out being alone isn't much better, just a different kind of empty." She finished cleaning his wounds in silence. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and studied him. "My mother died when I was 12. Soldiers attacked our camp, your soldiers. She hid me and my sisters in a root cellar, then went out to draw them away." Aiyana's voice was steady, but her hands clenched in her lap. "They shot her 7 times. She lived long enough to crawl back and tell us to stay hidden until dark. I held her while she died, felt her spirit leave her body like smoke rising from a cold fire. I'm sorry. I don't want your sorrow. I want you to understand. We've both seen too much death, both been emptied out by loss. But hiding from life isn't the answer." She stood and moved to the door. "Think about my offer, Josiah Mercer. I'm not asking for love. I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for a chance to create life instead of mourning death, to choose hope instead of fear." "Where are you going?" "Back to my grandmother's camp. It's not far." She paused at the door. "Black Crow will tell the council about tonight. They'll give me 3 days to decide my path. If you want to accept my offer, light a fire on the ridge at sunset on the 3rd day. I'll see the smoke and come. Then she was gone, leaving only the scent of sage and the echo of possibility. Josiah sat by his fire for a long time thinking. His body ached from the fight, but somehow he felt more alive than he had in years. He thought about Aiyana's words, about choosing hope over fear. He thought about the way she'd looked at him, not with pity or disgust, but with recognition. Another walking wounded, another survivor searching for a reason to be more than just alive. For 3 days he went through his routines, split wood, tended the horses, drank coffee at dawn and whiskey at dusk. But everything felt different now, charged with potential. He found himself looking toward the western hills, wondering about Aiyana's grandmother's camp, about what kind of life existed there. On the morning of the 3rd day, he woke to find a gift on his doorstep, a small leather pouch containing a perfectly round river stone and a sprig of dried sage. He knew without being told that it was from her. A token, a question, a possibility. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Josiah built a fire on the ridge. Not a small, careful fire like he usually made, but a proper signal fire fed with dry pine that would send smoke high into the sky. He sat beside it and waited. She came as the first stars appeared, riding a spotted horse, wearing a dress dyed the color of sunset. She dismounted and stood before him, dignified and certain. "You lit the fire," she said. "I lit the fire. Do you understand what you're choosing? My people will never fully accept you. Your people will call you a traitor. We'll belong nowhere except to each other." Josiah stood and faced her. "I've been nowhere for 6 years. Might as well have company." She studied his face, then nodded. "There are ceremonies, traditions. My grandmother will want to meet you, test you in her own way. Can you respect that I can try? Trying is all anyone can ask." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the fire reflected in her eyes. "Why did you decide?" "Because you were right. I've been performing a punishment instead of living a life. And because," he struggled for words, "because when you said you wanted to create life instead of mourning death, it was the first thing that's made sense to me since the war." She reached up and touched the bruise Black Crow had left on his cheek. "We're both broken, Josiah Mercer, but maybe broken things can fit together in ways whole things cannot." He covered her hand with his. "Maybe they can." They stood there as the fire burned down to embers, two damaged souls choosing each other over solitude, hope over fear, life over mere survival. The mountains watched, ancient and patient, as they began the slow work of building something new from the ashes of what had been. Over the following weeks, Josiah learned what it meant to court an Apache woman with proper respect. He visited Aiyana's grandmother, a wizened woman named Sage Smoke, who spoke no English, but whose eyes missed nothing. She tested him with silence, with sudden questions translated through Aiyana, with tasks that seemed simple but carried hidden meaning. "Bring water," Aiyana translated one morning. Josiah went to the stream and filled the clay pot. But when he returned, Sage Smoke poured it out and shook her head. "What did I do wrong? You brought water. She asked you to bring water." Aiyana tried not to smile. "To us, water is alive. You must thank it for its gift. Ask permission to carry it. Try again." It took 4 attempts before Sage Smoke nodded approval. Similar lessons followed: how to gather wood with gratitude, how to greet the morning sun, how to move through the world as a participant rather than a conqueror. "Your people take Sage Smoke said through Aiyana one evening. Take land, take lives, take resources. We accept what is offered and give thanks. This is why the earth turns its face from you and opens its arms to us." Josiah wanted to argue, to point out the complexities of expansion and progress, but he held his tongue. He was here to learn, not to defend a civilization he'd already abandoned. Meanwhile, Aiyana spent time at his cabin teaching him Apache words, showing him how to read weather signs, how to find medicine plants in the hills. They worked side by side, comfortable in shared silence, learning each other's rhythm. "You're different than I expected," she told him one afternoon as they repaired his roof. "How so? I thought white men needed to fill every silence with words. But you understand the value of quiet." "Spent too much time alone, maybe?" "No. You listen. Even before, when you lived here alone, you were listening. To the wind, the birds, the mountains. You just didn't know what they were saying. She taught him to hear what he'd been listening to, how the jays announced visitors, how the wind carried the scent of rain 2 days before it arrived, how the earth itself hummed with life, if you were still enough to feel it. In return, he shared his own knowledge, how to read, how to write, how to repair things with metal and tools. She was a quick student, hungry for learning. "My people say the white man's writing is dead words," she said one evening, practicing her letters. "But I think they're sleeping words waiting to wake in a new mind." "That's beautiful." She looked up at him. "My grandmother says beautiful words are dangerous. They make us forget to look for the truth behind them. What truth are you looking for? Whether you're here because you want me or because you're afraid to be alone." Josiah set down the book he'd been reading from. "Can't it be both? Yes. But one must be stronger than the other." She put aside her writing. "Which is stronger in you?" He thought about it, owing her honesty. 3 weeks ago it was fear. Now he met her eyes. Now it's want. Not just for company, but for you. Your strength, your certainty, the way you see the world. You make me want to be better than I've been." She nodded slowly. "Good. Because I didn't test you for a weak man's comfort. I tested you for a strong man's partnership." As autumn deepened toward winter, their relationship grew into something neither had expected. Not the passionate romance of youth, but something deeper, a recognition between two people who had survived their separate wars and chosen to build a peace together. The challenge came from both sides. Some Apache warriors still resented Josiah's presence, viewing him as an interloper. Some traders in town got wind of his relationship with Aiyana and refused to do business with him, but they weathered each storm together, growing stronger for it. One night, as the first snow began to fall, Aiyana came to his cabin with decision in her eyes. "My grandmother has given permission," she said. "If you're willing, we can be joined in the Apache way. What about the white man's way, paper and promises to a god who doesn't know this land?" She shook her head. "The mountains will witness us. The earth will bind us. That's enough." The ceremony was simple and profound. At dawn, on a mesa overlooking the valley with sage smoke, and a handful of Aiyana's relatives as witnesses, they stood barefoot on the cold earth. Sage smoke bound their wrists together with a cord woven from sweetgrass, and spoke words that Aiyana translated in whispers. "Two paths become one path. Two shadows become one shadow. Two hearts beat with one rhythm. The earth accepts this union. The sky blesses this choice. Walk together until the mountains fall." They sealed the bond by drinking from the same cup of spring water and sharing a piece of bread made from acorn flour. No rings, no papers, no grand proclamations. Just two people choosing each other in the sight of the eternal. That winter was the happiest Josiah had known since before the war. They expanded the cabin, adding a room, improving the fireplace, making it a true home rather than just a shelter. Aiyana brought herbs and medicines, baskets and blankets. Josiah built furniture and improved their water system. Together they created something neither could have made alone. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, Aiyana weaving, while Josiah read aloud from his small collection of books. Sometimes she would tell stories from her people, not the sacred ones, which were not hers to share with an outsider, but the teaching stories, the funny ones, the tales that carried wisdom wrapped in entertainment. "Why do your stories always end with someone learning a lesson?" he asked one night. "Because a story without teaching is just noise. Why do your books always end with someone getting what they want? Not all of them do. The ones you read do." She smiled. "You choose stories where broken people find wholeness. It tells me what you're looking for." Spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it arrived, it brought news that changed everything. Aiyana was pregnant. She told him at dawn as they stood watching the sun paint the peaks gold. "I felt the quickening yesterday, a flutter like a bird testing its wings." Josiah pulled her close, overwhelmed. "Are you happy?" Happy is too small a word. She placed his hand on her still flat belly. "I'm complete. For the first time since my mother died, I feel like I'm adding to the world instead of just surviving in it." They began preparing for the child with a mixture of Apache tradition and practical frontier necessity. Sage smoke came more frequently, bringing herbs and advice. Josiah built a cradle from pine and willow, carving it with symbols. Aiyana showed him mountains for strength, rivers for adaptability, stars for dreams. But their happiness was shadowed by growing tensions. The local Indian agent had gotten word of their marriage and was making noise about illegal cohabitation. Some of the younger Apache warriors, influenced by talk of resistance from other tribes, spoke of driving all whites from the territory. "We're living between two storms," Aiyana said one evening, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Neither side wants us to exist." "Then we'll be our own side," Josiah replied, "like we've always been." The confrontation came in late summer. The Indian agent, a small bitter man named Holcomb, arrived with 2 soldiers and a paper. "This arrangement is illegal," he announced, not even dismounting from his horse. "Apache are wards of the government. They can't enter into contracts, including marriage, without approval." "She's my wife," Josiah said simply, "not according to the law. She needs to return to the reservation, and you need to stop this aberration." Aiyana stepped forward, her pregnancy now obvious. "I go nowhere." Holcomb's face reddened. "You don't have a choice, woman." The soldiers will do nothing," Josiah interrupted, moving between them and Aiyana, "unless they want to explain to their commanding officer why they attacked a pregnant woman and a veteran of Chickamauga." One of the soldiers shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, maybe we should," Quiet Holcomb snapped. Then to Josiah, "This isn't over. That half-breed bastard you're whelping won't be recognized by any court. It'll have no rights, no standing, no future." "He'll have love," Aiyana said quietly. "That's more than you can say." Holcomb left, but they knew he'd be back, probably with more soldiers and legal authority. That night, as they lay together, Aiyana voiced what they both were thinking. "We may have to run." "No." Josiah's voice was firm. "No more running. This is our home. Our child will be born here, raised here. We make our stand here, even if it means fighting, especially if it means fighting, but not with guns, with persistence, with refusing to be moved, with living our lives despite their objections." He touched her face. "That's a different kind of courage, maybe harder than the battlefield kind." Aiyana kissed him softly. "You've changed, Josiah Mercer. The man I first watched would have chosen isolation over confrontation. That man didn't have anything worth fighting for." Their son was born, as the first snows fell with sage smoke attending, and Josiah pacing outside like every expectant father since time began. The baby's first cry was strong and clear, echoing across the valley like a declaration. They named him Samuel Soaring Hawk. Mercer Samuel for Josiah's father, Soaring Hawk, for the bird that circled overhead during his birth. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, a perfect blend of 2 worlds. The Indian agent returned when Samuel was 3 months old, this time with a federal marshal and an eviction notice. But he found more than he expected. Josiah had used his military connections to write to a sympathetic senator who had initiated an inquiry into reservation conditions. Several townspeople, won over by Josiah and Aiyana's quiet dignity and obvious devotion, had signed a petition supporting their right to live as they chose. More surprisingly, Black Crow was there, along with several Apache warriors. Not to support Josiah exactly, but to make it clear that Aiyana was under their protection. "This is complicated," the marshal said, looking at the assembled group. "No," Sage Smoke said in heavily accented English, her first words in that language anyone had heard. "Simple. 2 people. 1 child. 1 home. You complicate." The marshal looked at the eviction notice, then at the baby in Aiyana's arms, then at the mix of white and Apache faces watching him. "I'll need to consult with my superiors," he said finally, and left without serving the papers. They never came back. As Samuel grew, he became a bridge between worlds. Apache children came to play with him, their parents initially wary but gradually accepting. White settlers, seeing Josiah's success with Apache agricultural techniques, came seeking advice. The cabin became a neutral ground, a place where both cultures could meet without conflict. "You did it," Aiyana told Josiah one evening, as they watched Samuel toddle after a butterfly, his laughter bright as water. "You found a way to make the broken pieces fit. "We did it," he corrected. "And we're not done yet." She leaned against him, her hand finding his. "No, we're not. But it's a good start." The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Somewhere, a owl called. Samuel laughed again, pure joy in the sound. And in that moment, in that place between worlds, they had everything they needed. The years that followed weren't without challenges. There were droughts and hard winters, sickness and loss. Sage Smoke passed peacefully in her sleep when Samuel was 5, but not before teaching him the stories and songs she felt he needed to carry forward. There were still those on both sides who disapproved of their union, their life, their child, who walked between worlds with confidence and grace. But there were more victories than defeats, more neighbors who came to accept them than reject them, more moments of joy than sorrow. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Rose Morning Star, and another son called James Runs with Wind. Each child was a testament to the possibility of unity, of choosing love over fear. Josiah never forgot the broken man he'd been alone in his cabin, split between grief and emptiness. But that man seemed like a ghost, now a shadow cast by someone who hadn't yet learned that the human heart, like broken bones, could grow stronger at the mended places. On their 10th anniversary, marked not by the calendar, but by the Apache way of counting seasons, Aiyana gave him a gift, a war shirt decorated with beads and quills, each design telling a story of their life together. "You're not Apache," she said as he admired it. "You'll never be Apache. But you're my warrior who fought without violence for our right to be. Wear this and remember that the greatest battles are won with patience and persistence, not bullets." He wore it proudly, this white man who had learned to greet the earth, to thank the water, to listen to the wisdom in silence. Not perfect, never fully belonging to either world, but creating with Aiyana and their children a third option. A life defined not by blood or tradition, but by choice and commitment. Standing on their porch one evening, watching their children play in the yard where he'd once fought Black Crow, where federal agents had tried to tear them apart, where 2 broken people had chosen to build something whole, Josiah understood what Aiyana had meant all those years ago. They were broken things that fit together in ways whole things never could. And in that fitting, in that choice to trust, despite the risk to love, despite the fear to stand together, despite the pressure to stand apart, they had found something better than healing. They had found home. The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and pine, of coming snow and distant fires. Aiyana stood beside him, her hair now touched with gray, her hand still finding his after all these years. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. Choosing this life, Josiah thought of his empty cabin, his careful isolation, his whiskey-dulled evenings trying not to remember. Then he looked at what they'd built, not just the expanded home or the successful ranch, but the life. The children who carried both traditions forward, the respect earned through quiet persistence, the love that had grown from a desperate test into something unshakable. "I regret it took me so long to find you," he said. She smiled, that same knowing look she'd given him when she hung upside down from a fence post, testing whether he was worth the risk. "The spirits know their timing," she said. "We weren't ready sooner. Too much healing still to do alone before we could heal together." Samuel called out from the barn he'd found a injured hawk and wanted help tending it. Rose was trying to calm the bird while James ran for the medicine bags Sage Smoke had left them. Their children navigating both worlds with an ease their parents had to fight for. "Coming," Josiah called back then to Aiyana. "Ready always," she said. And together they walked toward their children, their future, their proof that sometimes the most unlikely unions create the strongest bonds. The world would continue to change around them. The frontier would close, the reservations would shift, the laws would evolve. But here, in this valley between worlds, they had carved out a space where love was louder than law, where family meant more than blood, where 2 people who should never have met had created something worth fighting for. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. To find someone who sees our broken places not as flaws to be hidden, but as spaces where light can enter, where love can take root, where new life can begin. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of hope. And in a cabin that had once sheltered loneliness, A family gathered around the fireproof that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to trust another broken heart with your own. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Old West, where love transcended boundaries and two wounded souls found healing in each other. These cowboy love stories remind us that the human heart knows no borders, and that sometimes the most beautiful families are those built on choice rather than convention. If you enjoyed this Wild West story of love, redemption, and the courage to stand against prejudice, please share it with others who appreciate tales of the frontier. Until next time, may you find your own courage to choose love over fear, and may your broken pieces find their perfect fit. More Wild West love stories await.